Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Eric Mitchell, the Audrey Geisel University librarian and co-director of the Holocaust Living History Workshop, along with my colleague, Professor Deborah Hertz. I know we're all looking forward to tonight's program featuring Dr. Abraham Rubin in conversation with Dr. Hertz. And I want to thank you all for your attendance tonight and partnership in sustaining our Holocaust Living History Workshop, a joint endeavor between the UC San Diego Jewish Studies program and the library. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to tonight's sponsors, Joel and Nancy Dimsdale. You both have been wonderful supporters of this program for many years. Thank you. Now in its 17th year, the workshop would not be possible without your support. It allows us to not just hold these workshops, but also to record, preserve, and share these lectures for everyone. You can view many of our past workshops, sign up for our newsletter, and consider making a donation to the workshop by visiting the library's website. And we'll drop a link here in the chat in a few minutes. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping notes. Closed captioning is enabled, so if you'd like, please turn on closed captioning using the button at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to submit questions, we encourage you to submit questions throughout tonight's program, and Dr. Hertz will get to them at the end of the lecture tonight. You can use the Q&A feature to submit all of your questions. And tonight's program will be recorded and will be posted on the library's YouTube page and added to our digital collections over the next few weeks. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I'm really happy now to introduce Dr. Abraham Rubin and Dr. Deborah Hertz for tonight's program. Dr. Rubin is an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Dayton, where he's been a full-time faculty member since 2022. He earned his BA from the University of Haifa and his MA from Tel Aviv University before receiving his PhD in comparative literature from the City University of New York. Following his doctorate, he held a series of prestigious postdoctoral positions, including appointments at Lawrence University, Goethe University in Frankfurt, and served as a distinguished fellow in the Martin Buber Society of Fellows at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's a scholar of literature, religion, and intellectual history, and his research focuses on Jewish autobiographical narratives of conversion and apostasy. His research has been published in the field's top-tier journals, including the Jewish Quarterly Review, the AGS Review, Jewish Social Studies, and Literature and Theology. With Dr. Rubin tonight is Dr. Deborah Hertz, and she likely needs no introduction with any of our audience members. She's the Herman Wouk Chair in Modern Jewish Studies here at UC San Diego, and of course, co-director of our Holocaust Living History Workshop. She joined UC San Diego in 2003, having served in teaching positions at Binghamton University and Pittsburgh State University, and herself has held several visiting appointments, including at Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, Harvard, and the University of Haifa. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rubin and Dr. Hertz.
Thank you. And so I want to start out by saying that I'm grateful to the UC San Diego Library and Jewish Studies program for inviting me to be here today and present my work for the Holocaust Living History Workshop, to Jen Cormier, Professor Deborah Hertz, and Susan Homan for putting this event together. So what I'd like to do is start out by taking the first few minutes of this event to present a brief overview of my book, its argument, and introduce you to one of its protagonists. And so this is a book about individuals who face catastrophe. They were exiled, dispossessed, their relatives were murdered, they lost their professional vocations and overall sense of place in the world. They survived the Holocaust. And what they sought to do, the way they sought to make sense of their traumatic experience was through conversion to Christianity, or more significantly, through conversion narratives. And this is an important distinction to make. Undergoing baptism is one thing, but telling the story about it and fitting it into one's life trajectory is another. And I'll say more about that over the next few slides. So Jen, can we move on to the next slide? I just wanted to briefly introduce you to the book's cast of characters. So we have Karl Jakob Hirsch. He's an impressionist artist, stage designer, and modernist writer who emigrates to the United States after the Nazis come to power. And he returns to Germany almost immediately after the war with the hopes of reestablishing his literary career there. And 1 year after, in 1946, he publishes a memoir called Heimkehr zu Gott, Briefe an meinen Sohn, which seek to explain what brought him to Christianity. We have Alfred Döblin, who's a famed German expressionist writer who identified with the German intellectual left during the Weimar era. He converts to Catholicism in 1941 with his wife and youngest son in Los Angeles. And in 1949, he's back in Germany, and he publishes an autobiography called Schicksalsreise, where he turns his experiences of exile from Nazi Germany into a story of spiritual awakening. And there are quite a few curious omissions in that book, which have to do with his own involvement with the Jewish territorialist movement in the 1930s. Then we have Carl Stern. He's a Bavarian-born psychiatrist who immigrates to Montreal during the Second World War and publishes a best-selling memoir called The Pillar of Fire in 1951, which relates his conversion to Catholicism. And earlier in his life, he flirts with Zionism, socialism, Jewish orthodoxy, and all of these serve as kind of negative identities on his path towards Catholicism. And finally, we have Heinrich Bronstein, who was an influential legal scholar in the fields of intellectual property and antitrust law at Georgetown University, who also plays a very important role in reestablishing German and American academic connections after the war. And so you may have noticed that all of these figures are men. And I think that has to do with the gendered nature of the genre I was looking at. So as I was writing this book, I encountered, I would say, over a dozen memoirs of emigres that converted, but they didn't use the conversion as, I guess, the main focal point of their narratives. These men did, and that's what I was interested in. And so maybe we could talk more about this in the Q&A. And let's move on to slide number 3, where I want to introduce you to some of the questions driving this study. And so let's see the first question. So the first question has to do with, how do these testimonies relate to other forms of Holocaust memory? And so as I was writing this book, I noticed that there's this dialogue, if not debate, with other contemporaneous Jewish efforts to make sense of the Holocaust theologically, historically, communally, particularly with regards to Zionism, the establishment of the State of Israel, the history of Jewish emancipation and assimilation. So these converts, they're not only turning to Christianity, they're actually trying to make sense of that conversion with regards to other Jewish paths to modernity, other Jewish attempts to sort of think about the recent historical trauma with regards to their ideological and religious commitments. And the next question, what are the implications of fashioning one's survival story around the conceit of conversion? And so what I found was that Christianity provides these intellectuals with a kind of framework to reestablish a stable sense of self and meaning in the face of trauma. And so all these experiences of exile and displacement, they find their justification by uncovering some kind of deep structure of meaning, which has to do with their new religious awakening. Conversion makes them whole again. It allows them to reclaim their individual agency. But at the same time, I found that it comes at the cost of self-censorship and self-denial. Certain events are distorted, and these stories also, the theological significance that they find usually has to do with undermining the validity of other traditional and communal forms of Jewish identity. And also, there's a lot of demonization of fellow Jews. The next question that I was asking as I was writing this book was, so how does the relationship to one's Jewish past materialize through the act of life writing? And what is its place in the convert's new self-understanding? And so how do you incorporate the Jewish past that you were rejecting into your new Christian identity? Now, fortunately for them, you already have a pre-existing theological construct called supersessionism, the idea that Christianity is the new Israel. It is Israel according to the Spirit. And what they do is they map their lives onto this theological figure. There are other ways that they incorporate their life, their past into their new identities. And I'll try and give you an example of that as we look at the story of Karl Jakob Hirsch. And finally, question number 4 is, how do we conceptualize the Jewishness of historical subject who disavowed their ties to Judaism? So it would seem that as Jews or as individuals who disavowed their Jewishness, these converts really don't have a place in the same historical narrative as that of modern Jewish history. They don't identify as Jews, so what can they possibly tell us about the Jewish experience? And what I found is that, contrary to the idea that conversion represents a radical break with one's Jewish past, the way that they try to assert their new identities is very much entangled and relates to other political and cultural dilemmas that modern Jews were preoccupied with at the time. And there is the turning away from their past is central to their new identity as Christians. And so I want to show you, let's move on to the next slide, because I think this proves a very good visual illustration for what I'm talking about. So we see the cover of Carl Stern's memoir, The Pillar of Fire, which of course is a reference to the pillar of fire that led the Israelites through the deserts. And in this case, we have a Star of David, which is going up in flames, and it has a cross above it. And so this is, of course, a reference to the evolutionary trajectory of Stern's turn from Judaism to Christianity. But we also see the fire and the smoke. I think this is suggestive maybe of the crematoria, the smokestacks, as if to say, this is what moves. So the Holocaust as the pillar of fire that leads Stern to Christianity. And so another example of how what happens in these stories is, can we see the next slide, please, Jen? Is the case of Alfred Döblin's activism as a member of the territorialist movement in the 1930s. So his lectures on Jewish nationalism, Jewish cultural nationalism, were translated into Yiddish, translated to Hebrew, but then once we see his once his memoir is published, there's just no trace of that part of his life. And so for Döblin to appeal to German audiences after the war, he just had to completely censor certain parts of his life. And let's move on to the next slide, which also I guess gives us an idea of what's happening in this book. So this is not only the story of the conversion, it's also the reception of these conversions. And these stories, they caused quite a scandal in the Jewish world. There were a lot of responses came up in the German-Jewish diasporic press. But this one is from the foreword in 1948, and the title is Naya Mishumadim, Kranke Neshamos Vergehen weg von jüdischen Volk. And so this is a very nasty review of Hirsch and Döblin's memoirs, which with the headline, The New Apostates, Six Souls Who Left the Jewish People. And so these stories were not well received in the Jewish world. And then the next slide is again an example of the Hebrew press and the scandalized responses to the apostasy of Karl Stern and Hirsch in Israel and in Mandate Palestine. And so I'd like to begin with the story of Hirsch, which I think can also fascinating character that I worked on with his published writings and in the archives in Munich. And so can we see the next slide, please? So Karl Jakob Hirsch is a Hanover-born Jewish emigre. He flees Germany in the mid-1930s. He has a miserable time in the US. His marriage falls apart. He's destitute. He works a series of low-end jobs, and he is chronically ill. He converts in 1945, towards the end of the war, in the Upper West Side at the Second Presbyterian Church. And he goes back to Germany as working for the US military. He works as a censor. And so in Germany, he begins his career as an artist and a writer, and he's a very prolific writer. 1932, he has a breakthrough. His novel becomes a bestseller. And 1933 cuts this upward trajectory. And so when he returns to Germany, he has this hope of kind of reigniting the literary career that was cut off. And he does so with a book called Heimkehr zu Gott, Homecoming to God. But it is also kind of a homecoming to Germany, which is an account of his conversion to Protestantism in 1945. And curiously, the book finds an enthusiastic reception amongst German audiences, which is kind of suspicious because at the time, no Jewish survival or exile memoirs are being published in Germany. The only ones that you find are those of Jews who were saved by Germans. And then, Hirsch's text. And let's see what drew audiences to that book. Now, the next slide, which I think is, nope, back one, all right, so Hirsch is the great-grandson of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, otherwise known as the Rashar, who is a very central figure in modern Jewish history. Especially, he's essentially the person who invents modern orthodoxy, and he writes he publishes a book called 19 Letters on Judaism, which is an epistolary work, which there's a conversation between a young man and I think like an older an older teacher, which is all about like modernizing Judaism and modernizing orthodoxy. And what Hirsch does is he takes his own memoir as a kind of conversation with the great-grandfather's intellectual and religious legacy, and tries to show how his turn to Christianity is the fullest realization of the famous great-grandfather's spiritual heritage. And let's move on to the next image. And so this is I found this in the archives. This is Karl Jakob Hirsch's certificate of baptism, and the church he belonged to or the community, it was just made up of other German Jewish refugees, and it was led by a fellow convert as well. And let's look at the next image as well. And so this is also, a very central part of Hirsch's story is the relationship with family. And so Carl Jakob Hirsch has a twin brother by the name of Gottfried Hirsch, and he serves as a kind of foil for his own spiritual evolution. The brother Gottfried is he flees to Palestine and settles in Jerusalem. And I think 2 or 3 years after he moves there, he has some kind of lung infection and he dies, but not before he becomes completely disenchanted with the Zionist enterprise and feels like, his ideological choices have failed him. Now, of course, this is only something that we know based on his brother Karl Jakob Hirsch's testimony. And so Hirsch as well suffers from some kind of lung infection. He almost dies, but as opposed to Gottfried, he's saved both physically and spiritually. And so the brothers are they represent the two different paths taken. And this is not only the case with the Hirsch memoir. We also find the same kind of conceit or theme in Carl Stern's memoir. Can we move on to the next slide? Stern as well. Stern has a brother who moves to Palestine and settles in a kibbutz in northern Israel, or what would later become Israel. And they stay in touch, but in the memoir, the brother's choice of Zionism is contrasted to Carl Stern's decision to embrace Catholicism. So the opposition between the ideological and religious choices are, again, they're just very, very central to the stories that these converts tell. And so I want to go to one of the spiritual turning points in Hirsch's career, and we'll look at the next slide for that. So in the memoir, at a certain point, Hirsch is hospitalized with heart and lung issues, and he's on the verge of death, but he survives, as opposed to the brother who we just saw. And he has this near-death epiphany, which is related to the film The Song of Bernadette, which was based on the novel of Franz Werfel. In this film, Saint Bernadette Soubirous, she's a simple woman who has a vision of the Virgin Mary, but she's doubted, she's questioned, she's harassed. She perseveres, and the water from the grotto where she witnessed Mary has these miraculous healing powers. And I'm wondering why Hirsch, as he's in the hospital and he's hallucinating, he has these visions of Saint Bernadette Soubirous, and I think that his identification with her might have to do with his own feelings of rejection and persecution by fellow Jews who are questioning his new religious conviction. And so, Jen, can we see the quote? Bernadette's simple and wise words, they touched my innermost being. I yearned to hear them again. And I went to see the film the following night, and again the night after that. It's hard to put into words, but it was as if something changed inside of me. When I came home, I felt the desire to pray for the first time since my childhood. And so this is also the first moment in the story where these kind of religious feelings are rekindled, and it's through Bernadette's naive or possibly innocent faith. And of course, the reviews of the book, they catch on to this argument. Let's see the next slide to see how the responses to this to some of the responses, at least, to Hirsch's story. And so, Shalom Ben-Horin, a reviewer in the German-Jewish Diasporic Press in, Mandate Palestine, writes, "And what was it that led him to Christianity? Typical for a modern urban city dweller, it was a film based on the novel of the Christianizing Jewish author Franz Werfel, The Song of Bernadette, that serves as his theological criterion. This is the tragicomic and troubling reality of the faithless Galit Jew of our time." Right. So you see here, there's some kind of lesson to be learned from the conversion. This is just the misguidedness of Jews who turn to Christianity. And here, let's see the next quote. And this is from Aufbau, which is the German Jewish press in the States. And Walter Mehring, the composer, writes that he was seduced to convert to Protestantism by watching a Catholic miracle film about Lourdes already seems incredible. Yet more troubling is the fact that this new baptized believer then chose to write a tractate of theological anti-Semitism worthy of a Sunday school essay. And so what was Mehring referring to when he accuses Hirsch of writing a tractate of theological anti-Semitism, which was worthy of a Sunday school essay? And so I want to give you like one quote that condenses that argument in our next slide. All right, and so, I think this is where Hirsch is referring to his baptism, and he says, "Never did I feel a stronger sense of chosenness than on the night I rose from death to life. I experienced the necessity of salvation, which every Jew strives for. The testament of Moses gives only law and not redemption. The Jew carelessly passed over the figure of the Redeemer. Indeed, he delivered Christ to death. This accursed path of the Jew from the cross in Golgotha to the gas chamber in Auschwitz must come to an end. A people cannot be destined by the Creator to exist as victims over the course of millennia. Liberation cannot come from the outside. No political power on earth is able to free the Jewish people from their curse. I know that what I'm doing today is sacrilegious in the eyes of many believing Jews, but I am obsessed and I am obliged to do this because there is nothing else for me." And this is a very, very troubling quote, which is then removed from the 1967 republication of Hirsch's book. Like all traces of anti-Semitism, or most of them, are expunged from the later version of it. But we see here how Hirsch is making a connection. First off, there's some traditional anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish arguments here about like associating Judaism as the religion of law rather than the religion of the spirit, of love, but also the way he connects the Holocaust to the killing of Christ. This idea that somehow this is a punishment for the Jews' deicide. So, this takes both vilifying Jews, taking a kind of a metaphysical perspective on the Shoah. I think these are the elements of the work that appealed to its audiences, the German audiences, immediately after the war. And so I want us to skip one slide and move to the diary slide. Let's move on to the next one. All right, and this is Hirsch. No, back one. Okay, this is Hirsch in the diaries, and I'll end with this one, where Karl Jakob Hirsch, he's been in Germany now for several months, and he's celebrating his first Christmas. And he writes, "When you consider that the Savior was born 1946 years ago, that people committed both good and evil in his name, that people were blessed and exterminated, when you understand all this, as I do today, you see the difficulties that lie in the realization of a teaching. I take all of this in like a student who is still very new to the class and who perhaps takes his lessons a bit too seriously. But the others are used to it. They have childhood memories that are usually more beautiful than reality. I tell myself that one can only properly understand the meaning of the Savior's birth on this day if one has an environment that feels the same. Yet I'm strangely isolated. I understand this now more than ever. There are moments when one becomes very clear-sighted. The greatness of the idea of salvation is clearer to me than those who take it for granted. I came to Christianity looking for community, but it exists only in spirit and not in reality." And reading this diary entry, I feel like we find two very different versions of Hirsch. One is the triumphal narrative he gives us in the published writings, and then when he's somewhat more honest with himself, I think there's a sense that maybe he didn't find what he was looking for when he converted. And so I want to end here and move on to the next stage with Professor Deborah Hertz. So thank you, Jen, for your help with the first part of the evening.
Okay, are we ready? Okay, well, I was extremely intrigued when I first came upon this book about a year ago and read it cover to cover once. Then I read it cover to cover again to prepare for tonight's talk. And I'm really amazed at the depth of psychological, historical, spiritual, and literary analysis which you brought to bear on these four people. Having said that, I wouldn't say that they come off particularly well as individuals. And I'm wondering if you think of your book as having a lot about the texts and about the template of a conversion narrative, and then you also tell us quite a lot about their lives. I know you tell us everything you can tell us, and in some cases, you have a limit to your knowledge because of your sources. But I wonder if we could concentrate on Hirsch here. And I wonder if you could give what you consider to be maybe the negative psychological dimensions to his personality on the eve of his baptism. And do you think it's fair for historians, or could be family members, or it could be rabbis, it could be priests, could be a lot of different observers of his act of conversion, to make a judgment and say, well, you thought this was sincere, but.
Yeah. So, so for the record, I'd say that trying to read this, trying to read his narrative back to some kind of dysfunction, whether psychological or familial, it's indeed unfair. And at the same time, like all psychological literature on conversion talks about how familial tensions play a role, like in individuals' conversions and the way that they tell the story of their conversion. And so whether it was like whether there are familial tensions or some kind of psychological difficulties is a possibility. I didn't think it was fair to pin it on that. At the same time, you could say that maybe like these familial tensions, they're not the cause, but they serve as a kind of like a literary as a literary figure that allows them to tell the story, like the tension between the brothers or the diverging paths. And of course, all conversion narratives are told, use family members. Like if you think about St. Augustine's Confessions, it's the story of the turn against the father and back to the mother, right? Of some kind of return to origins. And you find that in these stories as well, where they rediscover some sort of childhood naivete, one which they encountered growing up in Germany when they convert to Christianity. And so while the narrators are maybe not the most reliable, the converts are not the most reliable narrators of their own lives, the acrimony that they express towards family members is sometimes, it's a literary device to establish the distance they've made from their origins. And of course, it's also a great metaphor for the conversion, right? It's the supersessionist movement of the story, the turn from Judaism, which has been like reinvented, and as Christianity is told through me removing myself from my family of the flesh and becoming part of a greater universal family of Christianity.
And what strikes me as being so tragic is the loneliness. So if you take someone who leaves Germany, they leave Judaism, then they're also leaving New York, and they're sort of maybe getting into conflicts with their siblings who were in Palestine. And yet they don't seem to find actual human beings who embrace them in their new faith and bring them a sense of community wholeness. The focus of the narrative, and as you reflect on their biographies, is that they're all alone. they've got the Jewish God, they've got the Christian God. And that just struck me as being so very sad and very different from the converts I studied, because the converts I studied in the early 19th century, the Jewish women, their conversions enabled intermarriages. And they were, as Heine put it, conversion was the entry ticket to Western civilization. And what that meant for these women was a new life as the wife of a Christian and as a Christian mother, perhaps. And the four men that you bring us so wonderfully in this book, seem to go basically from misery to misery. And one of the things that struck me there, because I'm always looking for layers of motives. Yes, there were spiritual things, but there could also be, as you just talked about, familial things, and also a kind of, this is really hostile to them, so I hope you won't take it too badly, but maybe a kind of crass opportunism that if I'm going to set my fate in post-war Germany, I'll become a more popular author if I'm a Christian, especially because, as you very well document, the publishers in post-war Germany in the 40s are not interested in what they're interested in now, which is remembering the Holocaust, being guilty, feeling shame, and all the things we associate with contemporary German attitudes.
Mhm. Well, I don't think that the isolation is the case of all of them. It definitely Hirsch is a very tragic story, and that is kind of like a lachrymose version of Jewish history that we find there. But Kronstein had a thriving career. I don't. He really managed to rebuild his life, and it's the same case. It's the same with Stern. He was a very popular speaker on the Catholic lecturing circuit. So I think it's only the first two figures, Hirsch and Döblin, who have a harder time after the war, reestablishing their cultural credentials and reconnecting to audiences. Regarding the point about the crass opportunism, they really didn't see it that way. And I mean, I think that it would be fair to give them a bit more credit. We all try to paint our motivations in the most generous and benevolent way possible. And so it is true that maybe they were, they might have been in a, like they had certain blind spots as they were writing these stories and trying to justify their conversions, because it is true. I think that they were expecting to, I don't find like just remove some obstacles from the way by converting, and they are aware of the negative associations with Jews converting to Christianity for opportunistic or materialistic motives, and they expend a lot of energy trying to convince the readers and possibly themselves that is definitely not the case with them, that they are somehow exceptions to the rule.
Yeah, what I'm thinking here is we historians, we often want to have conversations with the people we study, but we can't because they're dead. And I'm thinking that what was so amazing about your book was the way you use the conversion narratives, almost as if the narratives were speaking to each other, something we historians, just never do. And then if you'd had a chance to say, take Hirsch and, have a nice dinner with some wine and get to know him, and then move towards the more sensitive questions, what would be the first thing you might ask him?
I would just wonder about the personal relationships. I mean, I'm looking for the gossip that that wasn't there at the you don't find in the book. He seems to have he seems like, from the letters, he has a great sense of humor. At a certain point, he's writing his cousin. He has a Jewish cousin who reestablishes himself in Switzerland. And they're in contact. They're very close friends. And the cousin is like, okay, so you convert to Christianity, big deal. And so and he says that he's and you see that this, like, the Yiddishkeit is coming up in the letters. Everything that's been expunged and been censored, uh, he brings up in the letters, and he says he calls him, and so he's an insider again, and he tells he tells the cousin that I've been goykotiert, right? And so like I guess I'd be curious, there's just so much there, and that you see that the archives have been very neatly curated to remove a lot of dirt.
Really?
And so
How do you know that?
it's just because you see that a lot of letters are missing. There are things that are torn out. And
Wow.
so it's his third wife, Ruth Niemann, who it's a German woman who met him when she was working for the Americans. And she's actually the one who saved so many of his unpublished writings for posterity. And so I just ask about, like, for some kind of honest accounting of the missing parts
Yeah, I'm
of the
sure he would probably
Nachlass.
continue to keep a secret because he'd know you were a
Yeah.
writer and it wouldn't be secret. For the leftists, that's Döblin and Hirsch, I would have thought they would have gone to the DDR. And there's a comparative figure here named Arnold Zweig, who actually, you and I both taught in Haifa, and Arnold Zweig writes these letters to Freud from Haifa where he's actually quite unhappy. And then I think it's in 48 when he's invited to come live in the DDR. And I was a little bit shocked that these two leftists don't do that, because it's a much smaller society. The intellectuals, I think, have a lot more influence over the society. I think there would be a greater sense of community, a less materialistic society. Do you find any discussion of which Germany they should go to?
Well, let's just stick to the Hirsch case here. I think that his politics evolve. And so maybe he's not in the same place he was in the 1920s. And then it's a question of practicality. He is considering moving to the DDR in the late 40s. You see letters. He's writing Zweig, asking him whether Zweig can help him make the move. And at that point, he's already like, he's rethinking the conversion. He's saying that the priest who converted, or the pastor who converted him in the States, took advantage of his weakness. And how else might one understand his conversion other than as a reassertion of his socialist commitments, right?
Uh-huh.
Because who is Christ if not, the first socialist? And so, yeah, he talks a lot about, like, this kind of Sehnsucht, this yearning for this East as the true Germany. But at that point, I think it's already like the DDR is more, I think of it as being Kafka's Palestine. Kafka's also thinking about moving there, but it's never a real destination. It's just some kind of fantasy. And so, yeah, I don't think that was a real option for him.
Yeah,
And
I
I don't
wonder.
think it was a real option for Döblin either. Even though Döblin too he was in touch with a lot of people in the East.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I wanted to ask you this question about Judaism dying twice. You raised in your very first.
Oh, I think we
Well,
got cut off here.
Abraham, yeah, I think we just lost Deborah. um, we'll give her a minute to come back on. Maybe I see Jen joining us now in the background, so I'm sure they'll be back on in a second. Maybe you could pick up half the question that Deborah asked, and I don't know, go from there.
Well, maybe I can speak to another one of the questions that Deborah shared with me before the event, which
That's
was, she
wonderful.
asked me how I felt about the figures I was writing about. She says that, she was saying that there was a kind of like a neutral voice to the book, but where did I find myself? And so I say that, I found their choice very troubling on a personal level, and that their anti-Semitism really enraged me. And at the same time, like their vilification of other Jews, um, while painful to read, is also a central component of their own self-perception. And so I don't like using the term self-hatred because it presumes that there's a proper or right way to relate to one's own ethnic origins. But you could definitely say that there's a very negative perception of one's background in these texts. And so, the negative feelings I had towards them was both the appeal and the challenge of writing this book, to try and enter their minds and their worlds and understand the choices they made on their own terms. And so I was trying to find some kind of empathetic reading, or some kind of empathetic vantage point. And so while I'm critical of their rejection of Judaism, I'm also I question my right to do so. Don't they have the right to make their own choices? Right? This is, they're individuals after all. So what right do we have to judge them? And so one answer I have to that is that maybe that right, our right to judge them comes when they make their stories public and they turn their private lives into representative accounts of modern Jewish life. And so, yeah, that's the answer. And so, do you know what's happening with? I think they sent us something. Deborah, okay, upcoming updates. Eric, so can you field the questions from the audience at this point, or
Yeah,
is
why don't
that
we turn to audience questions? We have one question that's come in, and I'll get to them. So welcome our audience to submit more questions. I think from a library perspective, I'm actually really interested in how the archives for these individuals grew over time, and in a way, these individuals strike me as you know whose past is interesting because of some decisions they made. Could you actually chat a little bit about just the extent of the archives and what you found out, how you were able to do research on these individuals?
okay? So, I visited the archives. So Carl Jacob Hirsch's writings and his artwork, all of his journalistic work, all of these were preserved in the University of Munich, and it was very easy to work with everything that they had there. But it was the same with Carl Stern. But again, like I guess it even when you have these materials accessible, you don't always find what what you're looking for. Because I was, I was interested in their personal lives, in what was happening behind the scenes, and how those contrasted to their public identities. And so you're working through a lot of materials, and then once in a while you find a tidbit where, oh, this is interesting. This doesn't seem to, you know, they seem to be saying something very different than what they're saying in the public accounts. I don't know if I'm answering your question here, but it was, even though their literary estates were accessible, they didn't always have what I was looking for. And so
I mean,
that was the case with
yeah.
Kronstein and Stern, that it was just those nachles that were available, but they just the sort of the personal side of their lives and background were just not in the archives.
I mean, I just speaking as a librarian, I think that's often the case, is that the collections people leave represent their business lives or key moments, and don't always reflect the personal side. So diaries and other things are always really valuable in getting insight, but you're rebuilding your perception of these things. So let me turn to a few audience questions here. Um, so the first question says, in the Holocaust, Jewish people were persecuted justified by the fact they are Jewish. It's possible that the act of conversion as a result of being convinced, perhaps by coercion and out of terror, that Judaism is indeed the cause of suffering. I don't know if you have reflections on that comment.
Yeah, that is absolutely the case. So there's a historian by the name of a social historian by the name of Todd Endelman, who points out the fact that conversion out of Judaism did not save people during the war, and it was definitely unnecessary after the war in order to save oneself. And yet, thousands of Jews converted afterwards. And I think that this subset of intellectuals is a part of that phenomenon, right? All of these individuals converted after they had already fled Germany. And there was just this desire to, I guess they did not have very positive experience with their Judaism before. And so maybe this was another, some sort of unnecessary baggage that they wanted to do away with, because for them, Judaism was just associated with racial prejudice, with stigma, and with persecution.
Interesting. Thank you. Angelina asks, when researching sources like this, where you're reading as much information about someone's life as you can, does it ever feel invasive? That's an interesting question. When to you does somebody's life become open to investigation?
I guess that when they've left that information in the archives is one place where, did it feel invasive? A little bit, but I think that would, there's an appeal to that voyeurism as well. It's just like, look at,
Yeah.
It's just very, very, I was just very curious about, the twists and turns of that these people's lives had taken.
I could see that. I could see that. And Emo asks, was the act of conversion out of the spiritual belief that Christianity instead of Judaism was the way out of the tragic and horrific history background of the Holocaust, or was the act of conversion a more personal journey in which one finds more peace in one's religion than in the other? I think we've spoken to this a little bit. I don't know if you have more you'd like to build on there.
Yeah, it was both. It was both. It was finding spiritual solace in Christianity, but it was also, the personal appeal that it had, right? So it's the peace of mind, at least in the story that in the stories that they told, that they found. But then their life stories did not end with the publication of their testimonies about their conversion. And you see, like, some of the converts later on, Hirsch, is the case of Hirsch, he writes another memoir or another autobiography. It's never published, or at least not during his lifetime, where he really backtracks a lot of the claims that he'd made only 3 or 4 years earlier.
Wow. And so maybe the last question for tonight, it comes from Courtney. Is there a greater trend among the Jewish community or among those folks who convert to Catholicism versus Protestantism? And if so, why?
Oh, that's a great question. So I don't think I could talk about demographic trends in the case of these converts, because 3 of them converted to Catholicism. And at least according to Todd Endelman, the Jews in the United States usually converted to Unitarianism and Protestantism. So in this regard, I don't think that my figures are representative. And when I was trying to make sense of why they chose one confession over the other, I think it was very circumstantial. And then as they were writing their stories, you're sort of reading your life backwards. That's when they found the justifications. It was a sort of a retrospective attempt to to rework the details of your life into that confession that you ultimately chose.
Oh, how interesting. Okay, that's very interesting. Well, thank you, Abraham, so much for joining us tonight, and appreciate everybody's attendance and insightful questions. I'm happy to share that Deborah's fine, of course. Her computer did a Windows update and rebooted on us, so we'll check in with her after we conclude tonight. Our next workshop will be sponsored by Julie Galpor and will feature Dr. Lauren Rosie, and will be held in the Geisel Library Seuss Room on January 22nd, 2026 at 5 p.m. Her talk will focus on the use of religious conversion of children during the Shoah and the short and long-term implications of this practice. So thank you, Abraham, again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much.